Thanks for coming, everybody. I'm not going to take a lot of your time because I can't wait to hear Rick talk, but I do have just a couple of thank yous to add. There are a lot of people behind the scenes, in addition to our amazing students whose names are on the wall there. Please have a chance to say hello to them and ask them really hard questions about their work. But there are a lot of people behind the scenes that I wanted to remember to thank. The entire team at USC, Roski School of Art and Design, that helped us put this together. In particular, Catherine, right behind the camera there, who made everything run smoothly. And of course, our fearless leader, Haven Linker, the Vice Dean of Design, who continues to push us far beyond the boundaries of the classroom and what a traditional design practice looks like, and inspired a lot of us to try and experiment like this in a collaboration like this. I also wanted to especially thank Ed Garcia and Joaquin David, who are the installers and managers here, right? Really, are they here, Peter? Are they here? They left, they were installing up to like 1 o'clock today, another show. A huge part of the learning experience for the students in this project was not just to come up with ideas and concepts for the work or write about it or kind of be removed from it. They were here installing the work, and as you can see, a lot of very challenging pieces to install, and without Ed and Joaquin here guiding them, helping them so patiently and generously, we could not have done it. So I just wanted to make sure we said thank you to them. And congratulations. I'm so proud of you guys. We started off the class thinking we might fail, but if we failed, we will fail gloriously. So I think we did something in between failure and success today, and I'm very proud of you. Congratulations. So it gives me a great pleasure to introduce a transformative designer and artist and a cultural leader, Rick Griffith. Rick is the Cultural Affairs Commissioner for the City and County of Denver and the chair of the Public Art Policy Committee there. He's one of the authors, contributors, and organizers of Denver's newly installed cultural plan. And in his free time, he's the principal and design director at Matter, and his avant-garde practice goes far beyond most traditional studios, with a deep concern for public good and design with a purpose. And this was a big reason of why we asked you to be the keynote speaker for our exhibition, and we're just so excited to have you. So please join me in welcoming Rick.
Chat with, not to, maybe for you, I don't know, we'll figure it out. There are so many ways that I could start this, like really so many ways. This is sort of what I feel like the talk should be. It shouldn't be enough that I actually lit and carry a torch for something important, but now you want me to make money at it? This is completely damn ridiculous. And that's sort of what I call the notion of designing in the public good, or designing with your city and working on civic-minded projects. Thanks a million to these guys, of course. Shireen, Haven, David, Stephen, Vita, Catherine, and a special thank you to my kids who have been really brave and really smart for letting me continue to talk to other people's children. It would be totally reasonable of them if they decided to be selfish with my time right now. And a special thanks to all the students who put this work on the wall. It's an incredible effort. And during crits yesterday, I have to tell you, it was sort of like, it was hard not to want to tell them just how difficult this work is, no matter how old you get, no matter how good you get at it. Putting this kind of work up takes a lot of courage, first and foremost, and the courage to see your work in this space and know how it needs to be improved and know how to sort of move your ideas forward takes a lot, so thank you for that. This is the record that changed my life. Let's see if I can play it. I'm going to X out of this for a second and see what happens. This is the back cover, and that's the front cover. You can see how somebody who encountered this record at the age of 16 would say, I don't know what they call the guys who make album covers for a living, but I'm pretty sure I want to be one. It just so happens that the back cover of this is really a telltale of my state of mind. Let's see if I can get this to play. Hold on a second. Hopefully someone's still on the audio over there. No? Maybe? Yes? Nope. Do we have audio? No. He's abandoned his post. Audio. Okay. This is the music it was. And then this is some of the collections of things that I really love. The one on the left is a piece by Louise Bourgeois, and the piece on the right is from Jean-Michel Basquiat's notebook. So the kid in the middle at the bottom is me at 16 years old. I thought I'd give you a little bit of context. In the top left is a person by the name of Diga Vertov. Did a fantastic film in the early part of the last century. Next to that person is Frank Lloyd Wright, Malcolm X, Beatrice Ward, Muriel Cooper, and Ray and Charles Eames. These are the sort of key influences that I've had in my life. And I admit there's something for everyone here, but it's worth saying also that locals Ed Fella and Archie Boston have been a tremendous influence on me as well. Just for the record, I want you guys to know, if you don't already, that there's a lot of blackness. There's a lot of different kinds of blackness. I'll tell you a little bit about mine. I used to think that my kind of black was pretty special. I was born and raised in the southeast London by two British West Indians who immigrated to the UK to do medical school. And then in the 80s, we picked up and left what was quickly becoming fascist London and moved to the suburbs of Washington, D.C., the most affluent community my parents could find for me and my brother. When I arrived in Washington, D.C., I found what we can call sort of the hardcore punk rock movement that's largely linked to DIY sort of culture. And from there, started to scheme and plot my own future. It came out of working in record stores and like sort of absorbing American culture through music. it's a good time to tell you guys that in light of recent events, I have to say, like, being black is special to me. It's just what I am, and I'm a British West Indian that recently naturalized to the United States. But I feel like I'm being told that Black lives matter, and I'm sort of, as an intellectual, I'm kind of resisting the idea that I should tell you that, or anyone should tell you that. Just so you know, I kind of found a bit of a conflict there for me. I think it's a movement that people want to help you understand that you shouldn't get it twisted. It's not open season on young, strong Black men. And whether you're afraid of them or not is not the issue. I think we all want to live in a world or a county or a city where people just don't do that with what they're afraid of. So I think what we're really talking about here is the idea that we have to manage sort of people's way of expressing fear. That's what I think is at the sort of the corner of all of this. I'm not telling you how to feel about people. I'm just saying fear can make a lot of crazy things happen. And for me, just because I have teenage children, I will say the operative word is probably young. I'm here to defend the rights of young people, Black, white, and otherwise. And I'm afraid that what we're kind of looking at right now is a state that ever since the 80s, when this picture was taken, we're talking about sort of an increased anxiety and stress and fear of young people, and I don't think it's stopped. So I'm a dad, and this is what it might look like to be my kid, or for me to be your dad. I was embarrassing my kids on Governor's Island, New York, by riding this like tricycle around, you know, sort of yelling at people and having fun. I'm an avid gardener. This is our rooftop garden. And yes, I seem to wear that Spam shirt a lot. This is our meeting space. I'm an educator. Frequently, the colleges in the Denver area ask me to do critiques with their students. And also, I invite students to the studio to complete some portion of their work with me in a typography course in the print shop that I run. This is me doing some typesetting. And I do that reasonably well, so I export that work to other colleges around the country. This is a particularly nice piece that we did at STSU, which, if you can't read it from the distance, it says, "Seduction is overrated, very high standards are sexy, and beauty has substance and purpose." I also drafted this very interesting, to me at least, visual communication theory and practice curricula. It's about 5 years long. It's supposed to mimic that of a liberal arts education. And then this is me working at the Rob Roy Kelly Wood Type Collection in Austin, Texas, with a couple of students. This particular project was purchased by the museum, the Denver Art Museum. And then about 6 years ago, I took my efforts and attempted to coin a definition of graphic design. And I run the studio from this place. In practicing graphic design, it's implied that from deploying the most basic proportions of a letter form to negotiating the format inclusion of or reference to material objects, any competent attempt will include the creation and application of some sympathetic agreements, a concern, and further effort to ensure that the work is conditioned by the message it will convey. I know, it's completely retarded. But that's why it's annotated in this particular version, just to kind of fill people into what I'm talking about. Hold on. I think this will help. How's that? No? Is that better? Good? Okay. As the director at my design studio, Matter, text too small to sort of discuss, but we have a lot of different work that we do, and that includes urgent graffiti projects with that same definition of graphic design, where we almost got arrested. And then a definition of design later on. Most of this you can't read, but the idea is that I wanted to communicate how we embrace complexity, drafting books, doing pseudo public art projects with massive letter forms in the parks, and then 3 years later making products out of it. This is the latest sort of manifesto. I'll go over it with you later. This particular project, it's the latest thing that we've done. It's going to reveal itself to you fairly slowly. There's a typeface that was designed in 1915 called Fregio Meccano. It's an Italian face. It's modular in nature. And I got fascinated with it about 10 years ago, was trying to figure out how to make it useful. And we were even able to reduce it from 20 parts, 21 parts in fact, down to 9. And we had dreams of kind of making things out of it. And this is actually the most recent 14-foot concrete piece that we've built. And another one here. And we did two-dimensional and three-dimensional work with it. We did some tiles in concrete that we cast, and then we did the three-dimensional pieces as well, the larger forms. And this says, everything communicates something. As a commissioner of culture, a cultural commissioner, and in the public art realm in Denver, what I'd like you to understand is that there's certain types of complicated relationships inside the city that it feels like I have to navigate and also encourage people to engage with. It's not just about politics, like a way to get into it and get something done. It's actually, hopefully, by drafting documents like this, a way to engage it and properly wrap people's heads around their responsibilities and their obligations to each other in this ecosystem of ideas. But largely what we do, and I'm one of the few graphic designers to do this work, but what we do is we audit the process of selecting artists and selecting actual works for public art, and make sure that it is a transparent and open process that uses public money well. It is not about picking the work and being a juror or a judge of art. It is actually about the process. And the thing I like about that, of course, is that jurying the work seems to me like an incredibly difficult task if you're asking 20 people to show up and kind of sell it. But if you jury the process, then you find a person and you trust an artist to actually make the work. And you trust the fabricators to assist them as the process goes forward. Like I mentioned, I've been DJing since I was 17 years old, and so for me, it was one of the most pivotal early jobs that I had. I met a guy, I was trained by a guy named Lamont Prince, and he was the most queer person I'd ever met in my short life so far. And he was incredibly generous with his time, and right in the middle of the 80s, when we had, in this country anyway, an AIDS epidemic, it was one of the most articulate guys that I'd ever met, talking me through what was a crisis in his community and helping me become profoundly aware of what he was dealing with and how his struggle was my struggle. this isn't the first time it happened, but all through my life, what I've realized is that if you give people a little bit of time to share with you, I think we can all support each other. I'm not here for black people. I'm here for queer people. I'm here for women. I'm here for young people, you know. And all through my life, I've been negotiating with the idea that I would serve myself last if I could, as long as other people got what they needed. Okay, the studio work. So this particular piece, let's see. Nope. Builds remaining. Okay. We Are the Sea is a film that was drafted about 4 years ago. The entire soundtrack is done by Iron and Wine, and we were commissioned to do the opening sequence, the movie poster, and some other tools for it too, using wood type. It was an incredibly laborious project. All of this is typeset and printed on a 1951 Vandercook 219 AB press. And then we even added some hand-drawn type to it afterwards for incidental pieces. The studio does space design as well. This is a preschool that we designed, designing their front desk with drawers for children's books and adult books for checking out. So their front desk becomes a library, a place where a lot of activity happens while parents check in and do their billing. Open spaces so that kids can peek through and see what's going on, get involved. Like if you'll notice that the height of that shelf is a little low. And then etched stools so that kids can spell and do interesting things with the instruments around them, the tools around them. There's also tracks. If you follow particular tracks inside the space, what we did was we gave every kid a direction to the bathroom from whichever classroom they were in. We also do mural painting. If it's typography, we do it. In this particular situation, we've got a 11-story long wall that we did over the course of about a month. Some of our clients are interested in the social good, and they do profit-sharing programs with their constituents and buyers. So these are sort of everyday objects where 20% of the proceeds goes to a particular cause. They have 5 different causes that they rotate through every month: the environment, men's and children's health, women's health, and education. And then we also did some work to expose Colorado's creative community to the folks at the airport and to Civic Center space downtown, exhibit design as well. The exhibit was an opportunity to share the statistical data on the creative sector and expose a lot of people to what we knew about it but couldn't export in a logical way without sort of showing the product. So design comprises of Colorado's largest creative sector, and also it's the 5th largest sector of the entire sort of economic milieu of Colorado. Housefish, this particular client, is a sustainably sourced and locally manufactured furniture line in Denver. They engaged us at both the partner level and the client level. It's pretty common for clients to do that. And this particular work is all collaged work. And just so you have a sense of how difficult that is, that's how we generally take the photographs, is with humans' sort of bodies entwined with the furniture, and then Photoshop things out and about by I particularly like this particular piece. Right now, because of the farm to table movement, we're working with Colorado's food providers, food producers, and retailers to connect them together for markets. We're a sponsor of this particular initiative as well. This is a fun project that we just finished up not too long ago. Every Wednesday, we host a breakfast meeting at the studio where we eat together. We invite sometimes strangers, sometimes clients, sometimes friends. And during the summer, my kids, if they're home, to have a meal every Wednesday morning. We don't start work until around 11 o'clock. And generally speaking, you know, like when we, if that slide is visible, let me see. Generally speaking, we sort of promote the cohort at the time, at the same time as promoting our products. So we have a lot of photos of staff. But what I really wanted to do with you guys is share with you this. It's our employee manual. There are 10 policies that we have where our job is to communicate difficult ideas to aid in a better design practice. Everyone that's at the studio chooses me and I choose them. Rule number 1 is no sarcasm. I'll read the small print. Can you read it from there or no? It's not there? My bad. Let's see if I can get it up there. Better? If I do... Is that okay? Forward? Okay. Let me try and accommodate this really quickly here. Okay. Is it still there? All right, here we go. I guess we'll just do it like that then. Is it still there? Life. You got it? No? Yes? Say yes or no. How's that? I'm perplexed. Yes, no, maybe? How's that? Okay. Now if I turn on the mirroring, will it still work? My apologies. Is it still up? Excellent, okay. Okay, so sarcasm is ostensibly banned from the studio, policy number 1. It's an ugly format of language in every case designed to confuse and disarm your listener. In order to form and maintain a cohesive team, we will not use sarcasm for internal or external purposes. The strength and integrity of an argument alone should be a force for conclusion or resolution. Wednesdays are the exception due to the open invitation for breakfast where persons not known to the studio and not aware of our policy are often present. Persons not known are not bound to this policy. The general idea is this, if we're communicators for a living, then we should learn how to communicate and not dodge behind dirty formats like sarcasm. See if I can keep this going. Good? Okay. And can you read it, or is it too small to be read? So I'll paraphrase it for you then, if you can read it. Apologies are easy, give them without condition when they are required. It really means that we've got to move on. We've got to move forward. If we don't move forward, what happens is that we get sort of stuck behind transgressions, errors, mistakes, and instead of sort of owning them properly and moving on, what we do is we deceive each other to deflect or avoid confrontation. Other things that are easy to do are lists for other people, saying thank you, sharing food, and teaching what you already know. So, teamwork is hard. This policy is designed for when clients are around, when friends are around, when we're together as a team and something's gone a little bit wrong. Basically says don't panic. There's no requirement for you to confront or act or think with anger. Here are some codes. Code number 1, ask to get something out of the way. You will not be refused. It's sort of an internal language that we use. If you say what I care about is, then someone else is going to shut up and listen. If you say that there might be a bird inside the studio, that means that the management style of your boss, that is me, kind of flying in, shitting on everything and leaving is not acceptable. And therefore, I should stop doing that. And it also says recognize another person's fragile condition, right? So I might be like shitting on you at that exact moment, and all you have to do is make reference to a bird, and I'll stop. And then it's not Wednesday is what we politely say to each other when someone is sarcastic and doesn't seem to understand it. Say no when it makes sense. No thank you, pass, and I don't think we're a particularly good fit. These are all words that we should use often as we need to. Other things that we easily say no to is printing for other designers who need printing, because we have a lot of printing presses. The chance to do high-profile work for free. Solicitors, including streetwalkers, which is basically sometimes it's young people with portfolios who don't make appointments. And then relationships where our value is not clear, and also wastefulness. This is kind of an insurance issue. When you have 100-and-something-year-old printing presses that don't have safeties on them that can hurt other people, one of the problems is that you have to tell people that if you're not sober, you can't touch it. This is jokingly called the "you may not bring your girlfriend to the studio and have sex on my printing press." And it's, of course, a safety memo. This should be somehow fairly obvious to most people. The reputations of design studios are made in bars by interns. However, we would like to guide people towards a different kind of behavior. Acting as if every resource is scarce is kind of a foundational piece for us. The explanation here that says if further explanation is required here, it is likely you are not yet aware of this and many of the other primary cultural policies that matter. And then this is a pretty big deal. We participate in the type design community quite a bit, and what students are oftentimes used to doing is stealing fonts off the internet from unnamed type designers, and we would like to encourage both our students and our colleagues that type is a business along with ours, and if our employees can't adhere to good policy in that regard, then we can't participate in those communities. So by steal, we mean you may not take the fonts from the studio and use them on your projects, your personal projects. You may not give them to anyone. You may not give it to clients without an additional site license. And this is a very interesting policy which people keep on bumping into. We generally don't have the issue at the studio anymore, but this is not a common policy. Ed Fella enlightened me to a policy that he engaged when he was working with J. Walter Thompson in the Detroit area, and that was that he really wanted to ask permission to do any freelance work. He felt like he didn't want to betray the relationship. In that particular situation, I listened to him and I realized that for people to work at the studio, we spend so much time experimenting and learning together that if they did freelance work outside of the studio, it would really subtract from what the studio had to offer. So it was sort of like buying the milk without buying the cow sort of thing, which we don't think is a particularly good idea. The studio works because we are incredibly diverse about our output. Let me try and express it to you in ways that in sort of a simple framework. When you walk into the studio, what happens is you've got a storefront, and there's a storefront which is basically It's our office supply cabinet full of stationery and tools and instruments that we make for ourselves to use in the practice. And then you walk through that space into our sort of generic space where we shoot photographs and do a lot of different things, sometimes host parties. Then into the manufacturing space, which has a massive laser. Then into the print shop, which is 5 printing presses, most of them in the last century. Then you go upstairs and there's desks, and then there's my office, and there's the rooftop garden. But what happens in those spaces is that we produce things that are for ourselves or initiated by ourselves with a certain amount of risk in mind. Then we do client work inside of those spaces as well. We convene groups of people that are engaged by our various communities to do good work, meaning whether it's the farm to retail group that we support and help with, or whether it's the commissioners, or whether it's another group of people doing public artwork. We try and use space to convene those folks and have conversations and do a decent job of recording those conversations as well. But really what's happened here is that we've got sort of a designed life. I believe that we should be doing projects that enliven us, that make us happy. I also believe that we should be doing projects that help other people be happy as well, so sort of contributing to that. Design, I think, is like a good host. It sort of predicts the needs of its guests. And for us, we think that we validate the experiments that we do by making products, and then we validate ourselves to our clients by being inventive and creative beyond the typical scope of client work. Our engagement with our community is something that ultimately shows where we are invested. And we used to do a lot of work outside of our region, a lot of work outside of Denver, and now we're really about 85% completely sort of Colorado-centered business. There's enough people there willing to experiment and learn and risk that we have a good client base there, and also people who are very like sort of value aligned. At the center of our practice are these other documents, just like this one for our employees, that talk about the value alignment of our clients or our prospects to us, and with new processes and, you know, new tools. So we didn't just buy the laser that we have that makes the tools that we have and makes the products that we have, but we actually invested in it after doing a pretty, like a year-long study of whether or not that would yield the right kind of output for us. So instead of doing micro business management, we do sort of year-long and quarterly business management. Some of it's together and most of it is done in a team setting with the 3 administrators of the business, and then the creative work is done with the 4 designers. So it's basically year-long, quarterly planning to make sure that we can afford to continue to do the experimental work that we do. It's pardon me, it's taken a lot of practice to get there. Like ultimately, I think we really found a good groove about 6 years ago. But it took a lot of support staff to make sure that billing wasn't getting lost and things like that. So we're operating at like 60% billable rate, and then the other 40% is divided between administrative work and entrepreneurial work. It's a good question. I mean, maybe it's worth taking a minute to talk about the product space and the idea that design, in this room, design students are doing things that would be judged as art, and how interesting and challenging that sort of is. I think part of the problem that we've been bumping into is that people want to have this sort of strangely contrasting conversation about fine art and design, and which one is either better or related or under the rubric of the other. In this particular situation, I feel like what we can learn is that design doesn't have the same ambition as fine art, has a different set of ambitions or a different set of sort of goals. And in this particular setting, it seems that we're using design thinking, or a way of thinking with design, as a form of communication to put these works up. I don't think it's, like, in some way, it runs the risk of being sort of either bad fine art or bad design, but the energy that goes into it is talking about a new kind of designer and a new kind of visual artist. I don't like the idea of being called an artist at all. I just prefer to be called a designer, but I'm old and my ways are set. I'm here to sort of respect the new designer in whatever way that they need it, and say, keep making these things, these objects, these communications, these ideas, but remember that if you're going to make them and sort of want to be judged as art, you have to actually know art well. Like, you have to take all the art history credits if you want to be that kind of designer, and not just skimp out on a couple of credits. The idea that design wants to be judged as art is up to the individual, but I will say that that new designer, that new kind of designer, You know, it's a totally valid play. It's a totally valid space to be in, but you have to be prepared to carry a torch for two things, not just one. Do young people have any questions? Yes? I'm sorry, I can't hear. Get the microphone.
It said no sarcasm except on Wednesdays. I mean, what's with Wednesdays? Or is that sarcasm?
Is the question why are we exempting it on Wednesdays?
Except on Wednesdays, it said.
Why, except on Wednesday?
Oh, well,
Sarcasm.
because we invite guests over on Wednesdays, and when we invite the guests over, they don't know about the policy, which means that if we would be correcting our guests all day long, be very terrible hosts, you know? Like, if they're sarcastic in nature, we just have to let them be who they're going to be. But every other day of the week, you know, it's just us, planned to be us. And the other part of that, too, is that we sort of jokingly say, it's Wednesday, go ahead and bring your Kevlar, you know, because everyone's got to be tough-skinned sometime. So we kind of use it as a release valve of sorts for the sarcasm piece. Not everyone's comfortable with the idea that they wouldn't be able to be that way, but most people over time figure out the benefit of it. Yes, dear.
I have a question. As a designer and sitting on the commission, what's your approach to public art and how do you differentiate? Because, you know, public art's a different animal and how it's done. So here you are, a designer, and you have to look at a public art piece. What kind of hat and how do you look at it? How do you view it?
Yeah. My view on public art is that it is the work of the city to use the funds that are available. In our case, it's a 1% for public art mandate. It's part of the city council legislation. And the tagline for me about public art is surprise and delight. Like, give people something to engage with. Give them a puzzle in the right of way. Give them something that gives their eye a break from the mass media culture that we've sort of submersed ourselves into. It's not an advertisement, and it's a welcome break from that sort of space. What I think about public art in general, well, I mean, the good news for young people is that I would just say, you know, this stuff that, like, grown-ups are trying to pass off for creativity, it's a joke sometimes. I mean, you guys have a lot of work to do. If you want to do it, you should just do it. It's yours to screw up, right? But there's a lot of sort of mediocre public art out there. It's our job to make sure that the right people are submitting to the process and getting involved in the process, and the process is open and transparent and accessible. And it doesn't matter how old you are. We want to minimize the bureaucracy and maximize the sort of creativity and the output that's there. And I think there's room for a whole new cohort of participants in the process from the creative side. Do I think that public art could be better? Absolutely. Do I think the process is good enough? More than likely. But I also think that most young people, they just don't want to participate in it yet. So it's really about cities saying yes. Cities have to learn how to be like a culture of yes in order to get the best people to participate, instead of cities that are full of bureaucracies. And I know that this is a very, very big city, but it's also, I don't know, it's probably about 20 different smaller cities around that participate in their own public art programs, where they have a lot of choices about adopting best practices and getting better people involved. But yeah, it's a difficult bit of work, actually. It's like a love letter to your city if you get involved.
I'm going to ask another question, and then let's have him.
I don't want to put the burden completely on you.
How do you politely address, like, unsuccessful public art?
I politely address most things in the same way, whether it's public art or an unfortunate accident, like, you know, in the studio, like bad work. The practice that I run says everyone needs to make a bad first draft. Everybody needs to work it out. It's almost obvious when you look at work to say, you know, like, another draft of that would have yielded something completely different and more mature and something that touches on what we hope would be something kind of universal, something largely acceptable, and accessible by other people. I think when we talk about bad work or bad public art, it's about access. Like graphic design or design wants to communicate, right? It speaks to a need and it wants to communicate. So public art and design are much closer bedfellows than a studio artist or a fine artist and design. Public art has this purpose, this embedded purpose, and that is, in my opinion, to surprise and delight the onlooker, the citizen, right? And very often communication design is trying to do the same thing, you know, pique the interest of the general public or a very specific audience. So in my book, what I think we're talking about is like good criticism, good critique doesn't spare the person. It talks directly to the need and the effectiveness instead of speaking to people and aesthetics, right? So we can all talk about whether or not we like a color or we like a texture, but ultimately you have to ask yourself, what is the most effective way of looking at this? Like, was it effective and how can we change its effectiveness to increase that? Design wants to be spoken about that way, you know? Effective use of color, or effective use of typography, effective use of all the other tools and parts of the story. And I think public art wants to be talked about that way too. Is it visible? Does it do all the things it needs to do? Does it consider environment and climate? Does it encourage people to approach it? Is it accessible? Those sorts of things. I think the best way that most places can fix issues around bad public art or poor work is to have case studies and to draft documents around that and to talk about their effectiveness. And ultimately, the thing that you're going to see in bad public art or something that's poorly created or conceived is that it falls into disarray. It's ignored. It's not maintained. Nobody wants to fix it if it's broken. No one wants to clean it because there's just no sort of deeply held value around it. So you kind of know what you're looking at a lot of the time. Of course.
You put up a slide of your manifesto, and I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind going over some of that a little bit, because we're working on a manifesto project in one of our classes with some of these students. So
Oh, manifesto, sure.
do you mind?
There is some crazy, okay. So I'll walk you through, I can walk you through something that we did. I'll walk you through a particular piece. This one's super interesting, this latest piece. Can you read it or not really? So, I wonder if this is going to feed back if I stand over here. Nope, we're good. Okay. We're adopting this particular model as a way of being and thinking about doing. It starts with this notion that act as if every resource is scarce. And when we talk about resources, we talk about resource management being one of the fundamental sort of primary acts of design, is to look at your resources and understand the constraints that they create. After that, it's say no when it makes sense. Do you remember that particular policy? Like, be willing to say N-O, no thanks, pass. And then, of course, that shoots off into the ether. Work for the trustworthy. I think healthy sense of collaboration comes from a place of trust. Know the price for your best work. I say to people all the time, I'm not buying your worst hour, I'm buying your best hour, so I don't expect someone to underperform while they're working with me. So knowing the price for your best work is a pretty important piece of that. And at the same time, it says, don't cheat and practice piety. The idea of cheating, instructing someone not to cheat is actually a very purposeful and specific thing that we do at the studio, because cheating looks like a lot of things, including inflating one's value. And then piety is the idea that the more you know is the more you know you don't know. So we always try and engage that. Make time for complexity. Make time for things to be complex and also to be understood. Create or discover some constraints around your projects. Design from a precise point of understanding. This is a little bit about the learning and the empathy that goes into the design process, where we're oftentimes parsing new themes and topics. Examples like talking about the SEC and the mandate for digital reporting with 10Ks and financial reporting in the digital realm. And when we learn these things, there's actually really beautiful moments where you go, oh, I think I understand the concept. In order to design for that, it's important to return to those moments that you understand it, and then continue to present that for the participants in the process, meaning your audiences. Don't assume that they're going to understand it from a different vantage point, because you can't support it if you don't understand it. The more people inside your team, it gives you more access points to the way that things are understood or discovered, and that gives you breadth in your approach. I think it's an empathetic approach to communication design that people oftentimes skip over. Create a hypothesis. Everything is about something. That's what we always say. What's it about? Tell me what is it about? What does it inspire you to believe in? Support the best ideas, support good ideas. Follow instructions. There's always a leader. That's what it implies. Partnership in my world looks like today I'll lead and tomorrow you'll tell me what to do. There's no offense in the idea that someone assumes a leadership position in our studio and then relinquishes it the next day in order to be led by someone else. We all have different skill sets and different listenings. Listen, change, laugh, and talk and tell the truth. Once a week you should sleep. Twice a week you should read. Invent ways to share. And then, not quite finally, but just because you don't understand it doesn't mean it doesn't make sense. And then make a thing have value. As a closer, that's the whole point of what we do, is to create value exchanges and value amongst people. Whether it's selling a product or whether it's selling an idea, what you want to do is have a value and have that exchanged with your participants or constituents or audiences. And so this is a manifesto of doing, not just a manifesto of design, so to speak. But we're not short on that. Like the studio keeps on making new ways of trying to process and give people access to what we do and how we do and why we do and when we do. And so there's no shortage of that kind of work. The other one that's up here, it's super nutty. Oh, by the way, the story behind this is amazing. This particular moment in time, I got one of our new employees to cut an 8-foot by 4-foot stencil of the definition as we had coined it the year before, and we attempted to install it on this building that was being built across the street from us, and got busted by the police partway in the process of doing it. And the policeman sort of said, so what the hell is this? What are you doing here? We said, well, sir, this is the definition of graphic design. He's He's like, so you want to share that with people? You know, and I've been drinking bourbon all night, and I'm like, desperately, sir, desperately, you know, sort of strange. He's like, and then another cop pulls up right next to him, and it's the beat officer for our neighborhood, and he does this sort of good grief kind of thing, like what's happened here, like a disappointed parent, and lets us off the hook. But it was pretty interesting. I don't think I've been that close to being in trouble in a long time, all over that definition of design. The piece that, let's see if I can find one of them. It's probably over here. Hold on. This one's pretty interesting. This was part of an occupation at the Denver Art Museum. I did a 7-week installation occupation of my office, just my office, in the Denver Art Museum, and I worked there for 7 weeks from 10 till 4 p.m. every day, had my meetings in the gallery, but this was the definition of design piece that accompanied the work, where I wanted them to think of design in 3 distinct categories: design as a process, design as a product, and then design as communication, and ultimately sort of sifting the ideas that we had in the studio through those 3 different ports so that people understood what we were doing a little bit better. Communication design is such a massive category, but we do that for ourselves and for clients. Product design is something that we do to create what we call residual income, right? So while we're busy experimenting with other projects, we would love to have people buy the products that we make and then give us residual income off of good ideas. And every 2 or 3 years is sort of a hit that comes out of the studio, like a good idea that makes a decent amount of money that keeps us going. And then design as a process, it comes into this sort of work where it says the participants in that are your worldview, your ability to collaborate, your deeply held personal beliefs, and the constraints that you have inside of your existence. Sort of like the skin that you're in or the circumstances that you're in are oftentimes very specifically going to contribute to your design process, or the way that you think about design, or the way that you think about the work that you have to do. Again, back to this notion that, like, if your needs aren't being met, then it's impossible for you to sort of realize or actualize particular kinds of ideas. So we try and work really hard on that a person needs to be in good health and in a good situation in order to do their best work. And it seems weird because, you know, like, students do their best work with some sort of divine intervention after, you know, 2 or 3 nights of not sleeping and drinking Red Bull and coffee, but yet adults do their best work after a good night's sleep and a chance to think about something. So, you go figure, you know. It's no wonder we don't relate to each other particularly well. The annotated version of the, and this book. Occasionally you do a book. 3 books so far. They all fall in the category of art books or artist-made books, which is a loose term, of course. But this particular book supposes to take one of the great influences of the studio, the work of Kasimir Milevich, and moves it forward in time and space to make assumptions about different types of common typographic geometries and the types of shapes that they create, and that we have this pattern recognition that's sort of inside of us, that we see things and find small amounts of joy, pleasure, or expectation in typographic geometries. And this particular short volume deals with that, but it was printed. What's interesting about it is that it was printed on a letterpress, 1 color at a time, and 10 colors in total. So it was a particular labor of love. And like I said, sort of what happens in the studio and the print shop is that we take on projects that have particular deep meaning to us, and we don't worry about the finances of it. We just try and make sure that we get it done so that the expression is complete. And we obviously inspire our clients to pay us good money so that we can take the time to do these kinds of investigations. I can't believe there are no young people curious. Oh, you're young enough. You'll work. You'll do.
Client base where they sort of, you have a group of clients that value your process and that you've been able to work with for a while. I'm kind of interested in where your clients come from, and if it's, do you pitch? Is it cold calls? Is it word of mouth?
Yeah, good question. It wasn't always this way, but we've been fortunate. Clients call. The phone rings. We have what's called a virtuous cycle of sorts. We do not pitch. I think that it hurts us in some ways. But then again, the challenge that we have is like this authentic life, right? The challenge that we have is to not be hypocrites to this kind of value alignment and do-good attitude that we have. So pitching sometimes means, not always, but sometimes it means that there's speculative work going on. And because we choose to spend the profit margin on experimentation and new materials and new tools, we don't have the kind of resources that it would take to pitch a client and lose. So we don't entertain that as a concept in the studio for big business. We almost say, well, why don't you pay us to give you a plan, and if you like the plan, then we'll do the work, right? And that kind of pitch is completely dependent on real money. The time it takes to produce that plan is paid for. But I go back to this notion of like where we spend the profit. We spent, the profit for the last year or so was spent learning how to cast concrete. The last 4 months in that concrete casting project. That's where it was spent. Like $20,000 worth of time that we would have invested in either a tool or something else, we invested in that particular casting project. And I think that's why we don't do the pitch type work, and that why we're not aggressive about it, is because we've already assigned that money to another project of sorts. It's a philosophy that supports us and our curiosity, and we have another sort of thought, which is buy what you need, but need less. So I don't live a very sort of what's the word I'm looking for? I don't live an opulent life. I live a simple life. My daughters understand how we live, and the joy that we get out of constantly learning and constantly experimenting with different tools and mechanics of design and physical language. That's our joy that comes out of that instead. It's a good question, though. Yeah, we're not an agency. We're a design studio, right? So different kind of vibe. Hello.
Hi. Speaking of finding the right clients, you seem to have a really dedicated and purposeful team. How do you kind of find the people that you want to work with?
Did you ask me if I fired people?
How do you find the people
how do
that
I
you want to
find
work
people?
with?
Okay.
Or fire them,
Yeah.
you know.
Sorry, the speakers are just pointing right back at you, so I have to do that to hear you, which is weird because I'm doing this to see you. It's a combination. So I teach once every 18 months usually, and in that teaching, I don't teach for one university. I teach for any one of the 3 or 4 universities in the area. Oftentimes, it's a great place for me to meet people who are similarly minded, value aligned, young, talented people, and I bring them in from those environments. It's starting to happen more and more that teachers that I know elsewhere might call me up and say, I have someone for you, and they'll send them in from Montana, or they'll send them up from Colorado Springs, or they'll send them in from some other place, and it would be an incredible experience usually, like, wow, this is the right person for us. So referrals from other teachers and an experience that looks a lot like a 4-month-long interview, if you know what I mean. teaching them and letting the best of the class rise to the top? That's a good question. And I do think, I mean, so let me expand on that for your purposes, for all the things that you might need out of that. Respect for the work has to be a first place to start. Using every project as an opportunity for self-knowledge so that you mature along with the work. Like if you just make it about the work, then what happens is that you sort of leave yourself behind. And going into the work afterwards and sort of bringing yourself up and say, wow, you know, I really did miss that opportunity to make it this way or do that. But just keeping yourself on point with the idea that self-criticism is a tool for becoming more mature as a designer. You're not always going to get the kind of criticism you need from your cohort or your teachers, and that's mostly because of time, and sometimes because of attitudes, and sometimes because of fear. So being clear about those two things usually puts you on the radar for one of your instructors, and usually if you're on their radar, what happens is that they look out for you. They look for opportunities for you because you are their charge, you know? If I don't hire somebody but I think they're fantastic, I'll place them. You know, if I don't have the room in the studio, but I meet somebody who's really skilled and has a great attitude, I'll call up another designer in my community and give them a shot at that person and give that person an opportunity to meet them. So largely from the place that, you know, the place that you are is the place, it tells you where you're gonna go. You know, connectedness. It's, I used to say life was short, and that's just such bullshit. Life is only short for some people, and that's tragic. But life is mostly long, and people need to behave as if that is the case. We're in communities where, you know, a little controversy goes a long way. I used to tell young people at portfolio reviews, go back and ask your teacher for the secrets of good typography. And then I got banned from going to portfolio reviews because the teachers were like, what the hell are you doing, dude? That's totally rude. I was like, I'm sorry. So a little controversy does go pretty far. But ultimately, I think that, you know, you'll show up. Not everybody can do that, right? Not everybody is self-realized, you know? Not everybody's self-actuated. So that's my tip. Be known. Be a known quantity to somebody who can do something about your condition. Any other questions? Yes. Besides we typically always say no to people who want to give us, or people who front load relationships. Front loading is when they say, man, this is gonna be awesome for your portfolio. Front loading is when people say things like, you know, I'm totally committed to giving you the exposure you need. Front loading happens when people say, I have a lot of business and my business is growing. It's sort of like, well, okay, but let's deal with what's in front of us now, and let's have you pay a bill before you create a bill 5 times that size, just based on the speed at which you're growing, the remarkable speed. You know, the things that, so I was invited to a small press sort of zine, like a zine show, right? Because I have these printing presses and we make things out of them. And the panel that I was invited to be a part of, we named Never Mess with a Guy with His Own Printing Press. And what we've been doing over the years is cataloging the times that people have actually stolen from us, like actually done us wrong. and we spend time typesetting the complaint, and we're going to publish them in a book eventually. And it'll just say things like, dude, you totally lied to me. You totally said that you would pay for it. You even promised the schedule, and then you ignored me. Thanks for nothing. Next page, right? Just to get it out, right? Sometimes there's a first name, never first and last, but the idea that people screw you over in business, I say this, I say, if a friend screws you over, that's life. Friends don't owe each other anything. But if a person in business screws you over, you have to create a consequence. The only consequence that I've been able to create is that that person becomes a non-person to us, and then we write one sentence and eventually get around to typesetting that one sentence. And at the point that we make the book or get an exhibit of all these grievances, people will know who they are, and everything is fine, right? But I just don't think that I don't think you should go through life like without creating consequences for people who are bad people. It's almost permissive, right? If you just let people get away with shit, they'll just keep on pulling shit. So sort of an idea. Which, by the way, is also true for employees and other children. You know, when you have kids, you have to create consequences. Just a thought. What have we got? We got a couple of minutes, maybe for one or two more questions, then we should break it up. Did I explain the practice well, or did I just sort of like screw it all up? No, I didn't screw it all up. Okay, that's good. So the whole point of talking about this practice that lives outside of commercial work, or this practice that breaks the boundaries of what a typical design studio would be, the whole point of that is to give the young designers a chance to be a different kind of young designer, like a yet uncharted type of designer, giving you permission to do entrepreneurial projects if that's what you have, the resources to do that, but also giving you an opportunity to get into manufacturing, micro businesses, work with people where your values are aligned instead of just work for anybody, right? I'm not saying that we wouldn't love some of Sony's money and we wouldn't love some of Warner Brothers' money, but what I'm saying is that, like, over time, what I've decided to do was, like, need less. Just need less, which means that I don't go after big pitches. I don't go after big businesses. That, generally speaking, the smaller ones are fine for me. And we enjoy each other's company and we do good work together, right? And at the end of the day, at the beginning of the day, you know, at the beginning of the day, I'm excited. At the end of the day, I can sleep. It's not the rat race of Madison Avenue where I came from before I started my own studio. I worked for Foot Cone Belding, Lieber Katz Partners on Fifth Avenue. I worked for tobacco. I worked for AT&T. I worked for Lennox China. I worked for these massive, sort of either benign or actually sort of malignant companies. And the agency that I worked for was an excellent place to make very bad decisions. They encouraged it practically, right? And so coming out of that and just sort of saying to myself, if I'm gonna have children, if I'm gonna be a parent, what I really want to do is to have a life that's worth sharing. And so needing less is the beginning of doing better things, making better decisions all the way around. And then after you need less, then you don't have to compromise your standards and you can build the kind of practice that you want. And it's a lot of sacrifice, but I'm not afraid of that. I'm not afraid of that at all. The idea that, like, you know, I had to sacrifice for 17 years in order to do the thing that I'm doing right now doesn't even have a hint of remorse in it. Like, so many amazing stories, so many amazing opportunities that were afforded to me, all because I just stuck to it. So my first client, when I left the agency, my very, very first client came from Union Square in the middle of New York City. I'm at the farmer's market buying some vegetables, and there's this guy playing a didgeridoo with his didgeridoo case busking. And I threw a couple of bucks in it, and I said, that's really, really amazing. And then I went back and I said, here's my business card. I'm a designer. If you ever need me, give me a ring. I didn't realize that he was the only didgeridoo player that had left Australia in recent years. He had played on all the important pop records, and he had his own record label with 3 or 4 releases already underneath his belt. He just liked to go to the park and play. First client. And he ended up being a $20,000 a year client for 6 years. Right? Just happened. After that, I was working in the performing arts in New York for a while. The Miller Theater at Columbia University was a big client of ours. And this is back when it was just me, one guy, one studio. So the Miller Theater came on as a client, and they wanted posters all the time. So I enrolled at Parsons and took printmaking classes at Parsons, meet with the client in the morning, sketch a poster on the train on the way downtown, go into the printmaking department, burn the screens. I had a roll of craft paper pretty often. I would sheet the roll, print the job, let it dry, roll it back up on the roll, and deliver the print job 2 days later. I just constantly did that. When I left New York, I set up a printmaking studio, right? The very beginning of that, so that I could do better production for that client and other clients too. Then it turned from being just a screen printing studio, and I found letterpress through one of my mentors. Wow, that's amazing. Started doing letterpress printing, then started doing offset printing. And then it just became this thing about self-sufficiency. The reason why Muriel Cooper is one of my heroes on that sheet, on that slide, is because she brought printing presses into the Visible Language Lab at MIT. And she told those designers it is incredibly important to be close to the means of production. The other reason why I got printing presses is because I bought printing in New York City, and it was incredibly expensive. And I said, I'm in the wrong business. People are paying for this piece of paper, and they're not paying for design. I think the design fee for my first few projects was a quarter of the printing budget. I was like, I'm in the wrong business. This is ridiculous. So I started going back into my past, and my parents were like, you have to be self-sufficient. You have to be self-sufficient. And I realized that self-sufficiency as a designer means moving towards production, owning printing presses, being in charge of that stuff, and controlling the flow. So the studio isn't nostalgic. We don't have 19th century printing presses because we're super nostalgic about type and design. What we do it is because we love having control. And then I basically backfilled the story with a deep understanding of typography and a deep understanding of the wood type industries and a deep understanding of wood type production. But that wasn't the initial reason. It was self-sufficiency.